Madam Speaker, excuse me, former Speaker Pelosi, let me ask you about December 15th, 2020. That morning, you attended a classified briefing on Operation Warp Speed and vaccine distribution timelines. That afternoon, your husband Paul bought $5 million in Pfizer call options. The next day, the FDA announced emergency approval for Pfizer's vaccine. Your husband made $3.7 million in 48 hours. Coincidence? FBI Director Kash Patel's voice filled the House Oversight Committee hearing room. It was not loud. It was not angry. It was calm, clinical, and devastatingly precise. The voice of a prosecutor who had spent 8 months building a case and knew exactly how unbreakable it was. Silence. Complete, heavy, suffocating silence descended on the room. Nancy Pelosi sat at the witness table, flanked by 3 high-priced attorneys in expensive tailored suits. She was 85 years old now, no longer Speaker of the House, but she still carried herself with the ironclad authority of someone who had been the most powerful woman in American politics for 2 decades. She wore her signature St. John's suit. Her hair was perfectly styled, and her posture was rigid. The armor of a woman who had stared down presidents, crushed rebellions within her own party, and survived every attack ever launched against her. But something was different today. For the first time in 40 years, Nancy Pelosi looked uncomfortable. She looked trapped. Because Kash Patel hadn't come with speeches. He hadn't come with partisan accusations or cable news sound bites. He had come with evidence. He had come with trading records, phone logs, time-stamped congressional calendars, bank statements. The kind of evidence you cannot spin away. The kind of evidence that doesn't care about your legacy or your title. The hearing room was packed, despite being officially closed door. Every seat was filled with committee members, staff investigators, and stenographers. The cameras were rolling for the official congressional record, capturing every twitch, every blink. The press was locked outside in the hallway, but they were waiting like sharks in the water, sensing the blood in the air. They knew something big was happening. This was supposed to be a routine testimony about stock trading reform. Republicans had taken the House in the 2024 elections and immediately launched investigations into everything. Pelosi had testified before Congress dozens of times over her career. She had expected this to be another session of political theater, Republicans posturing, her deflecting with practiced ease, everyone going home in time for dinner. Instead, she had walked into a prosecution. Because Patel had done something nobody had done before. He hadn't just looked at the public disclosures. He had actually traced the money. He had mapped the timeline. He had built the case. Pelosi's lead attorney, Marcus Stein, the kind of Washington lawyer who charged $2,000 an hour and knew every judge by their first name, leaned forward to the microphone. "Director Patel," Stein said, his voice smooth and condescending, "my client's husband makes his own independent investment decisions. Mrs. Pelosi is not involved in his trading activities. This line of questioning implies a connection that does not exist." "Your client's husband is 85 years old," Patel interrupted, his tone cutting through the lawyer's polish. "He has a degree in business from Georgetown from 1965. He is not a professional trader. He is not a financial analyst. He does not use a Bloomberg terminal." Patel picked up a single sheet of paper and held it up. "Yet somehow," Patel continued, "over the past 15 years, he has made 138 stock trades that occurred within 1 week of your client attending classified briefings or receiving material non-public information." 138 trades, Patel repeated. Average return, 41%. He paused, letting the number hang in the air. Warren Buffett, widely considered the greatest investor in history, averages roughly 20% over his career. Paul Pelosi is apparently twice as good as Warren Buffett. Patel leaned forward. But only on certain trades. On the trades where your client had inside information, he is a genius. On trades where she had no information advantage, trades in sectors she wasn't legislating on, Paul Pelosi averages 8% returns, slightly below the market average. So, Patel summarized, he is either a below-average investor who occasionally becomes the greatest trader alive through sheer, miraculous luck, or he is trading on insider information provided by his wife. Which explanation makes more sense? Patel didn't wait for an answer. He slid a document across the table toward Pelosi. Let me show you the pattern, Madam Former Speaker, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. March 2020. Patel pointed to the first entry. You attended a classified briefing on COVID-19 severity and the impending economic shutdown. The briefing detailed exactly how bad it was going to be. Information the public didn't have yet. 2 days later, 2 days, Paul Pelosi sells $5 million in airline stocks, hotel stocks, and cruise line stocks. 1 week later, Patel said, the economy shuts down. Those sectors crash. He avoided $2.1 million in losses that average investors suffered. He got out before the house burned down because he knew the fire was coming. June 2021. Patel moved to the next item. You are in closed-door negotiations on the infrastructure bill. You know which companies will get the federal contracts, information that hasn't been made public. 1 day later, Paul buys $2 million in Caterpillar and Tesla stock. 2 weeks later, the bill passes with provisions specifically favoring those exact companies. He makes $1.8 million. November 2021. Patel's voice was relentless. You are working on the semiconductor subsidies bill, the CHIPS Act. Paul buys $4 million in NVIDIA call options. The bill passes months later with billions in subsidies for chip makers. He makes $3.2 million. Patel looked up from his documents. 138 times, he said softly. Madam Former Speaker, every time you had advanced information about legislation, about government contracts, about regulatory decisions, your husband traded on it. Every single time. That is not coincidence, Patel said. That is not luck. That is systematic insider trading on a massive scale. Pelosi's face was flushed. Her hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles were white. She had been in politics since before Patel was born. She had survived everything. But this was different. This wasn't political theater. This was math. And the math was accusing her of a crime. This is a partisan witch hunt, Pelosi started, her voice tight, falling back on the defense mechanism that had served her well for 40 years. This is an attempt to criminalize public service. This is FBI financial forensic analysis, Patel countered calmly. This is subpoenaed bank records. This is trading records. This is phone logs. This is time-stamped congressional calendars. He picked up a thick binder. We have the exact time you entered the classified briefing. We have the exact time you left. We have the exact time you called your husband. We have the exact time he called his broker. We have the exact time the trade executed. This isn't partisan, Madam Former Speaker, Patel said. This is evidence. He pulled out more charts and timelines, spreading them out like a royal flush. You and your husband entered Congress in 1987 with a net worth of approximately $5 million, Patel said. You are now worth $240 million. He looked at her over his glasses. That is on a congressional salary that has never exceeded $223,500 per year. Let's do the math, Patel said. Even if you saved every single penny of your salary for 38 years, which you didn't, even if you paid no taxes, which you did, even if you had perfect investment returns on that salary, you couldn't have $240 million unless you were trading on insider information for 35 years. The room was completely silent now. Every eye was on Pelosi. Every ear was tuned to Patel's calm, relentless presentation of facts. "Let me show everyone exactly how you did it," Patel said. "Let me show you 15 years of insider trading, 138 trades, $140 million in ill-gotten gains, and the phone calls where you passed the information to your husband right after leaving classified briefings." Pelosi looked at her lawyers. She looked at the committee members. She looked at the cameras recording everything for history. And for the first time in her long political career, she looked like exactly what she was: caught. To understand how we got to this moment, how the woman who had been third in line to the presidency for years ended up in a congressional hearing room, unable to explain her husband's impossibly perfect trading record, you have to go back. You have to go back 6 hours earlier, to when Nancy Pelosi still thought she could handle this the way she had handled everything else. 6 hours earlier. Nancy Pelosi sat in her personal office in San Francisco, 3,000 miles from Washington, reviewing notes for her testimony. It was 8 a.m. Pacific time. Her private flight to D.C. left at noon. She had 4 hours to prepare for what she thought would be a routine harassment session by Republican committee members trying to score cheap political points. "They have nothing," Pelosi said to her legal team gathered around her desk. Her voice carried the confidence of someone who was used to winning. "This is Jim Comer trying to make headlines, trying to make me look bad for the cameras." "But there is no crime here," she insisted. "Paul's trades are all disclosed as required. Everything is legal. The Stock Act allows it." Marcus Stein, her lead attorney, silver-haired, reassuring, expensive, nodded in agreement. "The subpoena is broad," Stein said, "but we have multiple privileges to invoke. Spousal privilege protects your private conversations with Paul. Legislative privilege protects your congressional work. We don't have to answer questions about what you discussed with your husband or about your legislative strategy." Sarah Kim, another attorney, typed furiously on her laptop, reviewing the statutes. "Stock trading by members of Congress is legal," Kim confirmed. "Spouses can trade. The Stock Act just requires disclosure within 45 days. We have checked. All of Paul's trades have been properly disclosed. Some were late, sure, and we paid the fines. But they can complain about ethics all they want. Nothing was technically illegal." Pelosi's chief of staff, Jennifer Martinez, looked less confident. She stood by the window, looking out at the city. "What about the timing, Madam Speaker?" Martinez asked. "Some of these trades look really suspicious. Paul buying Pfizer right before the vaccine approval? Selling airlines right before COVID crashed everything? The Republicans have been building timelines. If they lay it out visually—" Stein waved his hand dismissively. "Timing isn't proof of anything. Sophisticated investors make educated guesses based on publicly available information. Paul reads the Wall Street Journal. He watches financial news. He has intuition. He can make his own investment decisions without insider information." Pelosi nodded, sipping her coffee. "Exactly. Paul has been doing this for 50 years. He knows the market." She felt a surge of validation. She had been through worse than this. Multiple ethics investigations over the years, Republican attacks calling her a socialist, a traitor, corrupt. Media scrutiny of her wealth. Nothing had ever stuck. She was Teflon. She was Nancy Pelosi, the first female Speaker of the House. The woman who had stared down Newt Gingrich, George W. Bush, Donald Trump. She had navigated Clinton's impeachment, Bush's wars, Obama's health care reform, Trump's 2 impeachments, Biden's agenda. She had survived everything. This would be no different. A few uncomfortable hours, a few non-answers, and she would be back in Napa Valley by the weekend. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that while she was focused on political survival, on managing her image, on crafting sound bites for cable news, Kash Patel had been building something very different. Not a political case, a criminal case. 8 months of FBI financial forensics, subpoenas to brokers, phone records, trading timestamps cross-referenced with classified briefing schedules. Patel had done what nobody had bothered to do before, actually follow the money with the full resources of the FBI. At that exact moment, 3,000 miles away, in FBI headquarters in Quantico, Virginia, Kash Patel sat in a secure conference room reviewing the final evidence package with his financial crimes team. The walls were covered with charts showing 15 years of trading data. Phone records, congressional schedules, all color-coded, all cross-referenced. He looked like what he was, a former federal prosecutor who had made his career building airtight cases against white-collar criminals. Dark suit, glasses, tie slightly loosened, surrounded by evidence binders organized with the precision of someone who knew he would be defending every single claim in front of a hostile witness. His lead investigator, Sarah Chen, stood at a whiteboard covered in timelines. She was in her 40s, a former SEC enforcement attorney who had moved to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. She had built cases against hedge fund managers, corporate executives, Ponzi scheme operators. But this case, a sitting former member of Congress engaging in systematic insider trading, was the biggest of her career. "Let me walk you through the final package," Chen said, clicking through slides on a screen. "We have 15 years of trading records," she began. 387 total trades by Paul Pelosi. We have analyzed each one. We cross-referenced them with Nancy Pelosi's congressional schedule, classified briefing logs, and committee hearing dates. She pulled up a chart. Of those 387 trades, Chen said, 138 show clear correlation with Nancy Pelosi receiving material non-public information. The pattern is undeniable. Average time between her receiving the information and Paul executing a trade, 2.7 days. Not the same day, Chen noted. That would be too obvious. Not weeks later, the information would be public by then. Specifically, 2 to 3 days. The sweet spot where it is close enough to capture the gain, but far enough to create plausible deniability. Patel studied the chart. "And the returns?" he asked. "On the 138 suspicious trades," Chen said, "average return of 41%. On the other 249 trades, ones where Nancy had no information advantage, 8.2%. She let that sink in. "So, Paul Pelosi is a below-average investor who occasionally becomes the greatest trader alive," Chen said. "The only difference is whether his wife had inside information. That is statistically impossible to explain without insider trading," she concluded. Tom Rodriguez, a former federal prosecutor now working as FBI legal counsel, spoke up from his seat. "We also have the phone records," Rodriguez said, "subpoenaed from both their carriers. In 64 of the 138 suspicious trades, this exact pattern appears. Nancy attends classified briefing, or sensitive meeting. Within 2 hours, she calls Paul. Within 1 hour after that call, Paul calls his broker at Morgan Stanley. Within 24 hours, the trade executes. He pulled up the call logs. Here is December 15th, 2020, Rodriguez said. The Pfizer trade. Nancy enters classified briefing on Operation Warp Speed at 9 a.m. Briefing ends at 11:45. She calls Paul at 12:17 p.m. 11-minute call. Paul calls his Morgan Stanley broker at 1:03 p.m. 8-minute call. Trade executes at 2:30 p.m. $5 million in Pfizer call options. Next day, FDA announces approval. Stock jumps. Paul's options are worth $8.7 million profit, $3.7 million in 48 hours. Rodriguez looked up. The timing is perfect, he said. Impossible to explain without Nancy telling Paul what she learned in that classified briefing. Patel reviewed the evidence systematically. This was how he had built his reputation. Meticulous preparation. Overwhelming documentation. Cases so airtight that defendants pleaded guilty rather than risk trial. Give me the top 5 most egregious examples, Patel ordered. The ones that are absolutely impossible to explain away. Give me the top 5, Kash Patel said, leaning over the conference table in the FBI's secure briefing room in Quantico. The ones that are absolutely impossible to explain away. The ones where the timing isn't just suspicious, it's mathematical proof. Sarah Chen, his lead investigator, didn't hesitate. She tapped her tablet, and the large screen on the wall cycled to a new slide titled The Impossible 5. Number 5. The EV tax credits, January 2021. Chen pointed to the timeline. Nancy is in secret negotiations regarding the Inflation Reduction Act. She knows specifically that the electric vehicle tax credits will be structured to benefit Tesla. That detail wasn't public. Paul buys $2 million in Tesla call options. The bill passes. The stock soars. Profit, $1.4 million. Number 4. The COVID crash, March 2020. This one is sickening, Chen said. Nancy attends classified briefings on the projected economic impact of the virus. She sees the models showing a global shutdown. 2 days later, March 19th through 21st, Paul sells $5 million in airline stocks, hotel stocks, and cruise line stocks. He dumps them right before the market collapses on March 23rd. He avoided $2.1 million in losses that average Americans, people with 401ks, had to eat. Number 3. The Taiwan visit, August 2022. Nancy is planning a controversial trip to Taiwan. She receives State Department briefings on how this will impact U.S.-China relations and, specifically, the semiconductor supply chain. Before she announces the trip publicly, Paul buys $4 million in NVIDIA and Taiwan Semiconductor. She announces the trip. Tensions flare. The sector jumps on supply chain fears. Paul makes $2.8 million. Number 2. The Infrastructure Bill, July 2021. She is negotiating the final markup. She knows exactly which construction firms are getting the federal contracts. Paul buys Caterpillar and United Rentals. The bill passes with provisions favoring those companies. Profit, $4.8 million. Number 1, Chen concluded, is the Pfizer trade, December 2020, the one we lead with. Briefing in the morning, trade in the afternoon, approval the next day. $3.7 million in 48 hours. Patel stared at the list. And the defense? They will claim Paul is a sophisticated investor, Tom Rodriguez, the legal counsel, replied. He isn't, Chen countered. We analyzed his portfolio. When he trades on non-political stocks, things Nancy doesn't touch, he performs worse than the S&P 500. He is only a sophisticated investor when his wife is in the meeting. Patel nodded, closing the binder. Pack it up. We have a hearing to get to. 5 hours later. The House Oversight Committee hearing room. The air in the room was stale, recycled, and heavy with tension. Nancy Pelosi sat at the witness table, her hands clasped in front of her. She had expected to be grilled by politicians. She had not expected to be dissected by a forensic accountant. Kash Patel stood at the podium, the binder from Quantico now open in front of him. "Madam former Speaker," Patel said, his voice echoing slightly, "we have discussed the Pfizer trade, but if that were the only instance, perhaps you could argue it was a lucky guess, a miracle. But lightning doesn't strike the same bank account 138 times, Patel said. He signaled to the clerk. A chart appeared on the monitors surrounding the room. Trade number 2, the COVID crash. Patel walked the committee through the timeline, the classified briefings, the models showing doom, and Paul Pelosi selling off his travel stocks 3 days before the rest of the country knew the world was ending. He saved $2.1 million, Patel noted, while the constituents you represent lost their retirement savings. Trade number 3, the infrastructure bill. Patel showed the correlation, the secret negotiations, the purchase of Caterpillar, the windfall. Trade number 4, the CHIPS Act. You were writing the bill, Madam former Speaker. You were drafting the $70 billion subsidy package for semiconductor manufacturers. And while you were holding the pen, your husband was buying the options. NVIDIA. $4 million worth. Profit. $3.2 million. Patel paused, looking directly at her. Did he predict that? Patel asked. Did he guess that the bill would include those specific subsidies? Or did you tell him? Pelosi's face was rigid. My husband makes his own decisions, she repeated, almost robotically. Trade number 5, the Taiwan visit. Patel laid it out. The diplomatic briefings, the purchase of semiconductor stocks before the trip was announced, the profit. 5 trades, Patel summarized, 5 examples of perfect timing. 5 instances where Paul Pelosi somehow knew exactly what was going to happen before the market did. And in every single case, it happened right after you had access to non-public information. These aren't coincidences, Madam former Speaker, Patel said. This is a pattern. This is an algorithm of corruption. He walked back to his table and picked up a pointer. But the most damning evidence isn't the trades themselves, Patel said. It is the math behind your total wealth. He clicked a remote. A new graph appeared on the screen. It was a simple line chart showing net worth over time. 1987, you enter Congress, net worth $5 million. 1987 to 2007, 20 years, net worth grows to $25 million. Patel pointed to the flat, steady line. That is reasonable growth, 500% over 20 years. Successful business ventures, good market returns. Then he pointed to 2007. 2007, you become Speaker of the House. You start attending the Gang of 8 briefings. You get access to the highest level of classified intelligence in the United States government. The line on the chart shot upward like a rocket. 2007 to 2010. Net worth grows to $40 million. 2010 to 2020, net worth grows to $175 million. 2020 to 2025, net worth hits $240 million. Patel turned to face her. Your wealth grew exponentially only after you got access to the secrets, Patel said. Congressional salary, $223,000. Paul's declared business income, $130,000. Combined, less than $500,000 a year. Yet your wealth increased by $200 million in 18 years. You cannot make that math work with a savings account, Patel said. You cannot make it work with mutual funds. You can only make it work if you are cheating. Nancy Pelosi's legal team was whispering frantically. Marcus Stein was scribbling notes on a legal pad, his brow furrowed. They had prepared for a debate about ethics and conflict of interest. They had not prepared for a timeline that linked Nancy's ascension to the speakership directly to the exponential explosion of her bank account. Director Patel, Stein interrupted, this is circumstantial evidence. You are showing correlation, not causation. Just because they made money while she was Speaker does not prove she gave him information. Wealthy people get wealthier. That is the nature of compound interest. Patel smiled. It was the smile of a man who had been waiting for exactly that objection. You are right, Counselor, Patel said. Correlation is not causation. We need a link. We need a mechanism. We need to know how the information moved from the classified briefing room to the trading floor. He opened the third section of his binder. So, we subpoenaed the phone records, Patel said. Both Mrs. Pelosi's cell phone and Paul Pelosi's. He displayed a spreadsheet on the screen. It was a dense grid of dates, times, and durations. In 64 of the 138 suspicious trades, Patel said, this exact pattern appears. He pointed to the columns. Column A. Nancy leaves a classified briefing. Column B. Within 120 minutes, Nancy calls Paul. Column C. Within 60 minutes of that call ending, Paul calls his broker. Column D. The trade executes. Patel looked up. Why the sudden urgency, Madam Former Speaker? You talk to your husband 2 or 3 times a week on average, but on days when you receive market-moving classified information, you call him 94% of the time. And then, Patel added, he calls his broker. He pulled up the December 15, 2020 log again. 11:45 a.m. Briefing ends. 12:17 p.m. You call Paul. 11 minutes. 12:28 p.m. Call ends. 12:35 p.m. Paul texts his broker. Patel read the text message aloud, retrieved from the broker's phone. Need to move fast on Pfizer. Call me Ayaseki. Patel let the words hang there. Need to move fast. Why did he need to move fast, Madam Former Speaker? Patel asked. The FDA approval wasn't public yet. To the rest of the world, it was just another Tuesday. But to your husband, it was urgent. Why? Pelosi stared at him, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't answer. But we didn't stop at phone records, Patel continued. We wanted to know what was said. He signaled to the clerk. A transcript appeared on the screen. The broker testimony. We granted immunity to Richard Chen, Patel announced. Paul's broker at Morgan Stanley for the last 20 years. In exchange for avoiding prosecution, Mr. Chen sat for a deposition. And he brought his notes. A gasp rippled through the hearing room. The broker had flipped. Mr. Chen keeps meticulous records of client instructions, Patel said. It is required by SEC regulations. Let me read from his sworn testimony. Patel picked up the transcript. Question. Did Paul Pelosi ever indicate where his trading ideas came from? Chen. Yes. Frequently. Question. What did he say? Chen. He would say things like, Nancy says the infrastructure bill is going to pass with these provisions, or Nancy is worried about the semiconductor supply chain, or Nancy indicated the regulation will be lighter than expected. Nancy says. Not, I think. Not, the Wall Street Journal says. Nancy says. He pulled up a photo of a handwritten note from Chen's notebook, dated January 21st, 2023. Client call Ari, Microsoft, AI. Client says wife attended meetings on AI policy, indicates light touch regulation, wants to buy $39 in calls. Patel pointed to the handwriting. That is your husband, Madam Former Speaker, telling his broker that you told him the government wasn't going to regulate AI yet. A trade that made you millions. That is not circumstantial, Patel said firmly. That is direct evidence of tipping. That is a witness, under oath, stating that your husband attributed the inside information to you, by name. The room was deathly quiet. This was the kill shot. The phone records showed the opportunity. The wealth graph showed the motive. But the broker's notes showed the crime. Patel closed the binder. He looked at Pelosi, who was now whispering urgently to Marcus Stein. Her face was pale. The coincidence defense was dead. The independent investor defense was dead. Madam Former Speaker, Patel said, I have presented the evidence, the math, the timing, the phone records, the witness testimony. Now, I am going to ask you a question. He waited until she looked at him. Did you share classified information with your husband? Pelosi looked at Stein. Stein shook his head slightly, his eyes conveying a grim message. Do not answer that. Madam Former Speaker, Patel pressed. Nancy Pelosi took a deep breath. She had spent 40 years answering questions. She was the master of the pivot, the spin, the non-answer. But there was no pivot for this. If she said no, she was lying to Congress, and the broker's testimony proved it. If she said yes, she was admitting to a felony. She leaned into the microphone. Her voice, usually so commanding, was barely a whisper. She paused. I invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. The phrase, I invoke my Fifth Amendment right, usually belongs to mobsters in RICO trials or drug dealers caught with the cash. It does not belong to the former Speaker of the House of Representatives. It does not belong to a woman who stood third in line to the presidency. When Nancy Pelosi said those words, the air in the House Oversight Committee hearing room didn't just change, it froze. The gasp from the gallery was audible. The committee members sat in stunned silence. Even the stenographer paused, her fingers hovering over the keys, as if waiting for a correction. Kash Patel did not gasp. He did not look surprised. He simply nodded, as if she had just confirmed a weather report. Let the record reflect, Patel said, his voice cutting through the shock, that the witness has invoked her constitutional right against self-incrimination. He looked at Pelosi. Her eyes were fixed on the table. She looked small, diminished, stripped of the aura of invincibility that had protected her for 40 years. Madam Former Speaker, Patel continued, you are exercising your rights, but I want to be very clear about what this means. You are refusing to answer because a truthful answer would expose you to criminal liability. He turned a page in his binder. I am going to ask you a series of specific questions. You may assert your privilege for each one, but the American people deserve to hear the questions. Patel looked at her, his expression unyielding. Question 1. On December 15, 2020, did you tell your husband that the FDA would approve the Pfizer vaccine the next day? Pelosi's lawyer, Marcus Stein, leaned in. Fifth Amendment, he whispered. I invoke the Fifth Amendment, Pelosi repeated, her voice monotone. Question 2, Patel continued. In March 2020, did you share classified economic projections regarding the COVID-19 shutdowns with your husband before he sold his travel stocks? Fifth Amendment. Question 3. Patel's voice grew harder. Did you tell your husband which construction companies would benefit from the infrastructure bill before the text was made public? Question 4. Patel pointed to the broker's notes on the screen. Did you tell your husband that the government would apply a light touch to AI regulation, as his broker testified? Question 5. Patel leaned forward. In the 64 instances where you called your husband within 2 hours of leaving a classified briefing, were you discussing family matters, or were you giving him stock tips? Pelosi closed her eyes briefly. Fifth Amendment. Patel closed his binder. The thud echoed in the silent room. No further questions, Mr. Chairman. Patel turned to the committee members. She cannot answer, Patel told them, gesturing to Pelosi. She cannot say no because the evidence, the broker, the phone logs, the math, proves she did. And she cannot say yes because that is a confession to a felony. So she takes the fifth. But in a congressional hearing, Patel noted, unlike a criminal trial, you are permitted to draw an adverse inference from a witness's silence. Her silence is an answer, and the answer is guilty. Chairman James Comer, the Republican from Kentucky, leaned into his microphone. He looked at Pelosi not with anger, but with a kind of clinical finality. Madam former Speaker, Comer said, do you understand the gravity of this moment? You are refusing to answer questions about whether you monetized national secrets. Pelosi said nothing. Her lawyers began packing up their briefcases, sensing the end. Based on the evidence presented today, Comer announced, reading from a prepared statement, this committee makes the following preliminary findings. 1. Former Speaker Pelosi and her husband engaged in a 15-year pattern of stock trading that shows a statistical correlation with her access to classified information. 2. The 138 identified trades generated approximately $140 million in profits that appear to be derived from non-public information. 3. Testimony from Paul Pelosi's broker establishes direct evidence that insider information was shared. 4. The witness has refused to answer questions regarding these facts. Comer looked up. Therefore, this committee refers this matter to the Department of Justice for criminal investigation and potential prosecution of Nancy and Paul Pelosi for insider trading, securities fraud, and conspiracy. We also refer this matter to the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, for civil enforcement and the disgorgement of all unlawful profits. And finally, Comer added, we recommend that Congress immediately pass the Stop Trading on Congressional Knowledge Act 2.0, to be known as the Pelosi Act, banning all individual stock trading by members of Congress. Your actions have proven exactly why this is necessary. This hearing is adjourned. The gavel fell. Nancy Pelosi stood up immediately. She didn't look at the chairman. She didn't look at Patel. She walked out of the room, flanked by her lawyers, moving quickly to avoid the cameras that she knew would be waiting in the hallway. She had walked in as a titan of history. She walked out as a suspect. As the doors closed behind her, Kash Patel began gathering his evidence files, the broker's notes, the wealth graph, the phone logs. He handed the master file to an aide. Send a copy to the Attorney General, Patel said quietly, and send a copy to the Southern District of New York. The hearing is over, Patel said, but the prosecution is just getting started. The hearing was officially closed door, meaning the public wasn't supposed to see it in real time. But in Washington, closed is a relative term. Within 2 hours, the transcript leaked. It wasn't a partial leak. It was the whole thing. Someone on the committee, or perhaps a staffer disgusted by what they had heard, uploaded the PDF to a secure server and sent the link to Politico, the Wall Street Journal, and Fox News. By 6 p.m., the headline was screaming across every chyron in America. Pelosi takes fifth on insider trading. FBI, $140 million in suspicious gains. Broker testifies, Nancy says bye. The political world went into cardiac arrest. Nancy Pelosi had been the Democratic Party's Iron Lady. She was the master strategist, the fundraiser-in-chief, the woman who kept the caucus in line. Even her detractors respected her survival instincts. But you cannot survive taking the fifth on stealing from the public. The evidence Patel had presented, the charts, the impossible 5 trades, the broker's notes, was plastered all over the internet. TikTok explainer videos broke down the Pfizer trade timeline. Financial bloggers analyzed Paul Pelosi's alpha and concluded it was statistically impossible without cheating. By the next morning, the dam broke. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer was chased by reporters down a hallway. "I haven't seen the testimony," he muttered, refusing to make eye contact. "I have no comment." The White House press secretary faced a barrage of questions. "The president believes in the rule of law," was the only answer she could give. "The Justice Department acts independently." Translation: "You are on your own, Nancy." The Department of Justice did not wait. The referral from the Oversight Committee arrived on the Attorney General's desk at 9 a.m. By noon, a special counsel was appointed to handle the investigation, removing it from the standard chain of command to avoid any appearance of political favoritism. Grand jury subpoenas went out that afternoon. They didn't just go to Nancy. They went to Paul. They went to the brokers. They went to the phone companies. And this is where the strategy shifted. Nancy Pelosi was 85. She was tough. She was a true believer in her own righteousness. She would fight this until the bitter end. But Paul Pelosi was different. Paul was a businessman. He liked his vineyard in Napa. He liked his Porsche. He liked his comfortable life in Pacific Heights. He had never signed up for federal prison. 2 months later, as the grand jury investigation heated up, the pressure on Paul became unbearable. The SEC had frozen their brokerage accounts. The legal bills were mounting, $2,000 an hour times 3 firms. And the evidence against Paul was actually stronger than the evidence against Nancy. Nancy had shared the info. Paul had executed the trades. He was the one on the recorded line with the broker. He was the one who texted, "Move fast." In a conference room at the U.S. Attorney's Office in San Francisco, prosecutors laid it out for Paul's lawyers. "We have him on 47 counts," the lead prosecutor said, sliding a draft indictment across the table. "Securities fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy. Based on the sentencing guidelines and the dollar amount, $140 million, he is looking at 20 to 25 years. "He is 85 years old," the prosecutor noted coldly. 20 years is a life sentence. He will die in a cell." Paul's lawyer looked at the indictment. It was airtight. The broker, Richard Chen, had already cut a deal. He had given up everything. "What is the offer?" the lawyer asked. "He pleads guilty," the prosecutor said. "He disgorges the money, and he cooperates." "Cooperates against whom?" "You know whom." The lawyer went back to Paul Pelosi. The conversation was difficult. It was the kind of conversation that ends a marriage, even one that had lasted 50 years. Paul Pelosi looked at the options. Die in prison protecting a legacy that was already destroyed? Or spend his final few years under house arrest or in a minimum security camp and maybe see his grandchildren again? He chose survival. February 2026. The news dropped on a Friday afternoon, the traditional time for burying bad stories. But this story couldn't be buried. Paul Pelosi pleads guilty, agrees to cooperate in prosecution of Nancy Pelosi. The plea deal was brutal. Guilty to 12 counts of securities fraud. Restitution, $82 million, the remaining traceable profits. Sentence, agreed recommendation of 18 months in federal prison, lenient due to age, health. Condition, full and truthful testimony regarding the source of his trading information. Nancy Pelosi found out from her lawyer. She was in her San Francisco office, surrounded by boxes of files she was packing up. "He took the deal," Marcus Stein told her over the phone. His voice was grim. He is going to testify, Nancy. He is going to tell them you gave him the information. Nancy sat down in her leather chair. She looked out the window at the Bay Bridge. For 40 years, she had been the one making the deals. She had been the one twisting arms. She had been the one who demanded loyalty. And now, the person closest to her, her partner in everything, had handed the knife to the prosecutors. She wasn't angry. She was too seasoned for that. She just felt a hollow realization that the game was truly over. "What does this mean for me?" she asked. "It means we can't go to trial," Stein said. "If Paul testifies that you gave him the Pfizer tip, that you gave him the NVIDIA tip, there is no defense. A jury will convict you in 2 hours." "We have to negotiate," Stein said. "We have to try to keep you out of prison." "I am the speaker," she whispered, almost to herself. "They wouldn't put a speaker in prison." "You are a private citizen now, Nancy," Stein said gently, "and you are facing the same judge who just took Paul's plea." Nancy Pelosi hung up the phone. She sat alone in the office that had been the command center of her empire. The photos on the wall, her with Obama, her with the Pope, her with Bono, stared back at her. They were artifacts of a life that no longer existed. The FBI agent, Kash Patel, had been right. It wasn't about politics. It was about math. And the math had finally caught up. Nancy Pelosi's legal team had built a fortress around her. They had constitutional arguments about legislative immunity. They had technical arguments about the definition of material non-public information. They had a public relations strategy designed to paint the investigation as a partisan smear campaign orchestrated by Republicans. But they didn't have a defense against Paul Pelosi. When the news broke that Paul had pleaded guilty and agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors, the fortress crumbled. The Department of Justice didn't need to prove that Nancy Pelosi intended to break the law. They didn't need to infer her state of mind from timelines or phone records anymore. They had the other person on the phone. And he was talking. In a sealed proffer session with the special counsel, Paul Pelosi laid it all out. He described the kitchen table conversations in their Pacific Heights home. She would come home late, Paul told investigators, according to leaked summaries of the interview. She would be stressed about a negotiation. She would vent. She would say, "These semiconductor guys are going to get everything they want in the new bill. NVIDIA is going to explode." And then I would go upstairs to my office and place the trade. He described the Pfizer call in vivid detail. "She called me from the car after leaving the briefing. She was excited. She said, 'We just got the briefing. It is happening tomorrow. The FDA is going to greenlight it. It is going to save the country.' She wasn't telling me to trade explicitly. She was just telling me the news. But we both knew what it meant. So I bought the options." It was a distinction without a difference under the law. Whether she explicitly said, "Buy Pfizer," or simply handed him the inside information, knowing he traded on it, it was securities fraud. She had a duty to keep that information confidential, and she had breached it. Faced with her husband's damning testimony, Nancy Pelosi had no cards left to play. April 2026. The plea negotiations were tense. The Department of Justice, led by a special counsel who knew the world was watching, refused to offer a slap on the wrist. They wanted prison time. They wanted forfeiture. They wanted a felony conviction that would stand in the history books. Marcus Stein, Pelosi's lawyer, argued for house arrest. "She is 86 years old," he pleaded in the conference room. "She is a historic figure. Prison would be a death sentence." "She made $140 million trading on secrets," the prosecutor replied, unmoved. If a hedge fund manager did that, he would get 20 years. The law cannot apply differently just because she held the gavel. On April 14, 2026, the deal was signed. Nancy Pelosi walked into the U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C. to enter her plea. The streets outside were barricaded. Thousands of people had gathered, some supporters weeping, holding signs of her past accomplishments, but many more protesters chanting, "Lock her up." She stood before Judge Sarah Martinez. She looked frail. The stress of the last year had hollowed her out. The defiant spark in her eyes was gone. "Mrs. Pelosi," the judge asked, "how do you plead to count 1, conspiracy to commit securities fraud?" Pelosi's voice was steady, but quiet. "Guilty." "How do you plead to count 2, insider trading?" She pleaded guilty to 38 counts. The terms of the plea deal were released to the public immediately. Prison sentence, 8 years in federal prison. Agreed recommendation. Fines and restitution, $127 million, representing the disgorgement of profits plus penalties. Forfeiture, she would surrender her congressional pension. Bar, permanent ban from serving on any public board or holding public office. The sentencing hearing was set for 2 months later. As she left the courthouse, released on her own recognizance until sentencing, a reporter shouted a question that cut through the noise of the crowd. "Madam Speaker, was it worth it?" Pelosi didn't answer. She got into her SUV and stared straight ahead. But the question hung in the air. Was $140 million worth the destruction of a legacy that had taken 40 years to build? The sentencing hearing was held in June 2026. The courtroom was packed. Every major news network had a sketch artist in the front row. Cameras were banned inside federal courtrooms. The atmosphere was somber, almost funereal. This wasn't just the sentencing of a politician. It was the funeral of an era. Judge Martinez was not known for her sentimentality. She had reviewed the pre-sentencing report. She had read the letters of support from fellow Democrats, which were surprisingly few. Toxic association was real. She had also read the thousands of letters from ordinary Americans who had lost money in the markets, while the Pelosis were getting rich on rigged bets. "Mrs. Pelosi," Judge Martinez began, looking down from the bench, "you held one of the highest positions in our government. You were third in line to the presidency. You were the Speaker of the House. You took an oath to serve the American people. Implicit in that oath is a promise that you will not use the immense power of your office for personal enrichment." The judge leaned forward. "But you did exactly that. You treated the United States Congress not as a temple of democracy, but as an information kiosk for your family's hedge fund. You exploited classified information, secrets entrusted to you to protect national security, and you used them to make stock trades. You made $140 million by betting on the very laws you were writing." "The message must be clear," Judge Martinez said, her voice ringing in the silent room. "Public office is not a path to personal wealth. Classified information is not a trading advantage. The law applies to the Speaker of the House just as surely as it applies to the janitor who cleans the house. I sentence you to 8 years in federal prison. You will surrender to the custody of the Bureau of Prisons within 30 days. The gavel fell. Bang. Nancy Pelosi did not cry. She nodded once to the judge, turned, and walked out. July 2026. Nancy Pelosi reported to FCI Aliceville in Alabama. It was a low-security federal correctional institution for women, but it was still a prison. There were no private jets. There was no security detail. There were no staff members to fetch her coffee. She was assigned inmate number 94201-007. She exchanged her designer St. John suits for a khaki uniform. She was assigned a bunk in a dormitory-style room. Her job assignment was in the prison library, sorting books for 12 cents an hour. The political world moved on with brutal speed. In Washington, the Stop Trading on Congressional Knowledge Act 2.0, now universally known as the Pelosi Act, passed the House and Senate with near-unanimous support. It banned all individual stock trading by members of Congress, their spouses, and their senior staff. It mandated blind trusts. It imposed massive fines for violations. It passed 418-2. Even the progressives who had defended Pelosi for years voted for it. The evidence of her corruption had been so stark, so undeniable, that voting against the ban was political suicide. 6 months into her sentence, a reporter from the Washington Post was granted a rare 15-minute interview with Nancy Pelosi in the prison visitation room. The article that ran the next Sunday shocked the nation. Pelosi looked older. Her hair, without its professional coloring, was steel gray. She wore no makeup. The lines on her face were deep. "Do you have any regrets?" the reporter asked. Pelosi sat in the plastic chair, her hands folded on the table. "I regret getting caught," she said, her voice raspy but unrepentant. "I regret that it ended this way. But I don't regret the trades themselves." The reporter pressed her. "But you used inside information. You cheated." Pelosi's eyes flashed with a flicker of the old fire. "Paul and I worked hard," she snapped. "We deserve to be wealthy. We served this country for 40 years. We gave up our privacy. We gave up our lives. Why shouldn't we be able to participate in the free market? We have bills to pay like everyone else. If we happen to know things because of our position," she added, "why shouldn't we be able to use that information? It's not fair that we should be penalized for being smart." The interview created a firestorm. Any lingering sympathy for the grandmother in prison evaporated instantly. The sheer entitlement, the belief that she was owed the right to inside trade because she served, confirmed everything her critics had ever said about her. Her daughter, Christine, gave a tearful interview to CNN a week later, trying to do damage control, but only making it worse. "My mother has always believed the rules don't apply to her," Christine said. "She spent 40 years in a bubble where everyone told her she was right. Even now, even in a cell, she doesn't think she did anything wrong. It is sad. And it is exactly why she is there." Nancy Pelosi remained in Aliceville. She organized a book club. She argued with the guards about prison policy. She wrote letters to the editors of newspapers that were never published. She was still the speaker in her own mind, but to the rest of the world, she was just inmate 94201-037, the woman who traded her legacy for a stock tip. Paul Pelosi served his 18 months in federal prison, but in many ways, the sentence he served inside the walls of the minimum security camp in Lompoc was the easy part. The true punishment began the day he walked out. It was October 2027. Paul was 87 years old. He emerged from the facility not into the waiting arms of high-priced lawyers or political fixers, but into a gray, drizzling California morning and the flashing bulbs of a relentless paparazzi. He looked frail. The 18 months had taken a heavy toll. He had lost 30 pounds. His skin was papery and pale, and he walked with a pronounced shuffle that hadn't been there before. There was no motorcade to whisk him away to Pacific Heights. There was no private jet waiting on the tarmac to take him to the vineyard. The plea deal had been ruthless in its financial precision. The $82 million in restitution And fines hadn't just skimmed the top of their fortune, it had liquidated it. The government had seized everything to satisfy the debt. The Napa Valley Vineyard, where they had hosted fundraising dinners for presidents and prime ministers, was sold at a government auction. The sprawling San Francisco mansion, with its view of the Bay Bridge and its rooms filled with history, was gone. The portfolio of real estate holdings, the venture capital stakes, the shell companies, all of it had been dissolved to pay back the $140 million they had extracted from the market. Paul Pelosi, a man who had spent decades moving in the most exclusive circles of American power, moved into a two-bedroom apartment in Daly City, just south of San Francisco. It was a modest, beige complex near a strip mall. His neighbors were not senators or CEOs, they were service workers and retirees trying to stretch their pensions. He lived on Social Security. The isolation was absolute. The friends who had once clamored for an invitation to their parties had vanished the moment the indictment dropped. No one called. No one visited. To be associated with the Pelosis was now toxic. He spent his days sitting in a recliner bought from a discount furniture store, watching the financial news channels that used to report on his triumphs. Now, they used his name as a cautionary tale. He spoke to Nancy once a week, during the allotted 15-minute phone call from FCI Aliceville. The conversations were strained, filled with long silences where neither knew what to say. They couldn't talk about the case. They couldn't talk about the future. They could only talk about the weather and the past. Paul's health began to fail rapidly in the winter of 2027. The stress of the trial, the shame of the imprisonment, and the shock of his new reality shattered his constitution. On a Tuesday morning in April 2028, 6 months after his release, Paul Pelosi collapsed in his kitchen while making coffee. He was taken to a local hospital, not the VIP wing of UCSF, where he would have gone before, but the general emergency room. He died that afternoon of heart failure. He was 87 years old. The death of a former speaker's husband would typically command wall-to-wall eulogies, flags flown at half-mast, and somber statements from the White House praising his service and patriotism. But Paul Pelosi did not get a statesman's send-off. The New York Times, the paper of record that Nancy had read religiously every morning for 50 years, ran an obituary that was brutal in its honesty. The headline did not shy away from the truth that had defined his final act. Paul Pelosi, 87, dies. Financier whose trading scandal destroyed a political dynasty. The article detailed his life, but the first paragraph was the only one that mattered to history. Paul Pelosi, the husband of former Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who pleaded guilty to a massive insider trading scheme that generated $140 million in illicit profits, died on Tuesday. Once a power broker in Democratic politics, Mr. Pelosi spent his final years in disgrace, having turned state's evidence against his wife in a scandal that reshaped congressional ethics laws. In her prison cell in Alabama, Nancy Pelosi received the news from the warden. She was not allowed to attend the funeral. The security risk and the media circus were deemed too great. She sat on her bunk, holding the printed copy of the obituary. She read the words over and over again. Disgrace. Scheme. Destroyed. For 40 years, they had built a legacy together. They had visualized their names on libraries, on airports, on schools. They had imagined a twilight years spent as the grand eminences of the party, collecting awards and applause. Instead, he had died alone in a rental apartment, and she was mourning him in a prison uniform. The grief was compounded by a terrible, gnawing realization. It was all for nothing. The money was gone. The reputation was gone. The time they could have spent together in their final years had been traded for stock options that the government now owned. She looked at the concrete wall of her cell. There were no cameras here, no microphones, no voters to perform for. For the first time since the investigation began, Nancy Pelosi put her head in her hands and wept. Not for the husband she lost, but for the lie that had finally stopped working. Nancy Pelosi remained in FCI Aliceville. The world outside continued to turn, but it turned without her. With good behavior, she would be eligible for release in 2032. She would be 92 years old. Her legal team filed petition after petition for compassionate release. They argued that her age, her frailty, and her service to the country warranted mercy. They argued that keeping a nonagenarian in prison served no penological purpose. But the courts were unmoved. Judge Sarah Martinez denied the final petition in 2029. Her ruling was scathing, citing the infamous Washington Post interview where Pelosi had claimed she deserved to be wealthy. Compassionate release relies on the concept of remorse, Judge Martinez wrote in her decision. The defendant has shown none. She continues to view her crimes as entitlements. She continues to believe that the laws she wrote for others did not apply to her. To release her now would send a message that the powerful are subject to a different standard of justice. This court refuses to send that message. So, Nancy Pelosi stayed. But while she faded away, her name lived on in a way she never intended. In 2028, Congress passed the Stop Trading on Congressional Knowledge Act 2.0. It was universally referred to in the halls of the Capitol, in the newsrooms, and in the textbooks as the Pelosi Act. It was the strictest ethics law in the history of the United States. It banned all individual stock trading by members of Congress, their spouses, and their senior staff. It mandated that all assets be placed in blind trusts managed by independent third parties. It imposed automatic expulsion and mandatory prison time for violations. The bill passed 418-2. Nancy Pelosi's legacy was no longer the Affordable Care Act. It was no longer the first female speakership. It was no longer the impeachment of Donald Trump. Her legacy was the law that stopped other politicians from doing what she did. She had become the cautionary tale that cleaned up Congress. In law schools and business schools across the country, the Pelosi case became a standard curriculum. In Criminal Law 101, professors used her case to teach the concept of constructive insider trading, how a spouse can be liable for trading on information they didn't technically receive directly from the source. In business ethics, students analyzed the Pelosi pattern, the 138 trades, the timing, the 41% returns. They studied the Kash Patel investigation as the gold standard of financial forensics. The lesson was simple, and it was taught to every future leader in America. Public office is a public trust. You cannot use it to become a billionaire. Back in Washington, the culture changed. The stock pickers in Congress, the members who used to brag about their portfolio performance, went silent. The late-night phone calls to brokers stopped. The frantic trading before committee markups ceased. The fear of being the next Pelosi was a more powerful deterrent than any ethics seminar. Kash Patel, the man who had brought down the speaker, eventually left the FBI. He wrote a book about the investigation titled The Math Doesn't Lie. It became a bestseller, detailing exactly how he had pieced together the puzzle that everyone said was unsolvable. In the final chapter of his book, Patel wrote a reflection that summarized the entire saga. Nancy Pelosi thought she was untouchable. She thought her power, her connections, and her political skill would protect her forever. She thought that because she wrote the laws, she was above them. She spent her entire career telling the American people to follow the money. She assumed no one would ever dare to follow hers. But we did. We followed it to the classified briefings. We followed it to the phone calls. We followed it to the bank accounts. And we proved that in the end, corruption is not a political strategy. It is just a crime. In the winter of 2030, a group of high school students on a field trip to Washington, D.C., visited the Capitol. They stood in the statuary hall, looking at the statues of great Americans. There was no statue of Nancy Pelosi. Her portrait, which had once hung prominently in the Speaker's lobby, had been removed following her expulsion, stored in a basement archive, along with other disgraced figures of history. The tour guide pointed to the empty space on the wall where it used to be. "That spot," the guide told the students, "reminds us that in America, no one is above the law. Not even the Speaker of the House." Nancy Pelosi had wanted to be remembered as a giant of history. She had wanted to be remembered as the woman who broke the glass ceiling. Instead, she was remembered as the woman who proved that the system could work, if you were willing to check the receipts. She had bet her legacy on a stock tip, and she had lost everything.